It began in a one-room cabin on the Kentucky frontier. On February 12, 1809, a child was born who would one day be called America's greatest president. The cabin measured only 18 feet by 16, with a dirt floor and no windows. Within those rough-hewn walls began a life that would shape a nation. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a man of quiet strength, known for his honesty and hard work. Though he had little schooling, he could sign his name and provide for his family through determination alone. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle and intelligent, able to read a little but unable to write. Together they lived simply, moving from one patch of farmland to another, struggling against the stubborn soil and the limits of poverty. When Abraham was 7, the family left Kentucky for Indiana. One reason was slavery. Kentucky permitted it, while Indiana did not. The Lincolns opposed slavery, and even as a boy, Abraham said he was naturally anti-slavery. It was a belief that never left him. Eventually the family settled again, this time in Illinois, where the young boy's character began to take shape. Abraham and his sister Sarah shared the hard labour of frontier life. He was tall for his age, strong with an axe, and by 8 years old, could split wood like a man. He ploughed fields, harvested crops, and hauled water, but refused to hunt. After killing a wild turkey at 7, he discovered that he hated taking life. Tragedy struck when his mother died, leaving Abraham and Sarah motherless in the wilderness. Their father, unable to care for them alone, returned to Kentucky and brought back a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. She arrived with real furniture, a bed, a table, and chairs that seemed to the Lincoln children like treasures. More than that, she brought warmth and affection. Abraham soon called her Mama, and she became the emotional centre of his young life. In those days, schooling was rare and brief. Abraham attended what were known as ABC schools and blab schools, where lessons were shouted aloud by every student at once. By 15, his formal education had ended, barely 1 year in total. Yet he had learned to read, and that changed everything. Books became his teachers. He read by firelight, walking miles to borrow volumes, determined to master every word. Paper was expensive, so he wrote his notes on wooden boards. When the surface filled with writing, he scraped it clean and began again. Those early habits built a mind both disciplined and reflective. He read slowly, carefully, often memorizing entire passages before moving on. Though Abraham Lincoln carried himself with a quiet seriousness, his warmth and humour made him well liked by those around him. He had a sharp wit and a taste for light-hearted mischief, once famously switching 2 grooms at a local wedding, a harmless prank that became county legend. From such humble and laughter-filled beginnings, the boy from the log cabin was already forming the character that would one day shape the nation. By the age of 21, Lincoln knew only that he would not follow his father's life on the farm. With little more than determination and curiosity, he set out on his own, seeking purpose and a place in the world. His first job came on the rivers of Illinois, helping to guide flatboats heavy with supplies down the Sangamon River. During one trip, the vessel ran aground on a dam near the small town of New Salem. Water began to fill the boat and the crew could not free it. Lincoln studied the problem carefully. Then he devised a plan. He drilled a hole in the bow and shifted all the cargo forward. As the water drained through the hole, the boat lifted just high enough to clear the dam. It was an act of quick reasoning and steady judgment that revealed his growing ingenuity. Denton Offut, the owner of the boat, was so impressed that he offered Lincoln a position managing a new general store in New Salem. To Lincoln, the town seemed large and full of opportunity. Within months, he became one of its most trusted citizens. He was fair in business, honest in every transaction, and known for treating people with respect, even over the smallest sums. As Lincoln settled into life in New Salem, his interest turned toward ideas and people. He joined a debating society, attended court sessions, and watched trials with deep fascination. The local justice of the peace often asked for his opinion, amused by Lincoln's humour, but also struck by his clarity and fairness. Word spread of the young man's insight, and soon others began coming to him for advice on legal matters. Not everyone welcomed his growing reputation. A rough group of farm boys known as the Clary's Grove Gang decided to challenge him. They invited Lincoln to a wrestling match, hoping to test his strength and humility. Accounts differ on who won, but all agree that his composure and dignity earned their respect. In time, the gang became his allies and loyal supporters. By 1832, encouraged by friends, Lincoln entered his first campaign for the Illinois state legislature. He did not win, but he came close. Around the same time, Offutt's store failed, and Lincoln lost his position. Soon afterward, conflict erupted between settlers and Native American groups in the region. Lincoln enlisted in the militia. Although he saw no direct combat, he later joked that he had shed his share of blood, swatting mosquitoes in the Illinois summer. When the war ended, Lincoln returned to New Salem and ran for the legislature again. Some farmers doubted that a town man understood their labour, so he joined them in the fields during harvest. His strength, endurance, and good humour earned their trust. With their support, and the backing of the Clary's Grove boys, Lincoln was elected to the state legislature. Driven by a belief that public service demanded a strong grasp of the law, Abraham Lincoln began to teach himself the subject with relentless dedication. Without the aid of formal schooling, he read every legal volume he could find, often studying outdoors until the last light of day. Neighbours recalled him lying in the grass beneath a tree, book in hand, adjusting his position as the sun sank lower on the horizon. His determination, curiosity, and innate sense of justice steadily moulded him into more than just a self-taught lawyer, but a rising figure of purpose and principle. By 1837, seeking new horizons, Lincoln moved to Springfield, the young capital of Illinois. The town was still rugged, its streets muddy and its cabins simple, but to Lincoln it represented possibility. It even boasted a bookstore, a small symbol of the intellectual world he had long yearned to enter. He began working in a friend's law office, helping to manage the paperwork. Organization was not his strength. He often carried legal documents tucked inside his tall stovepipe hat, and at times they went missing. Because the state legislature met only part of the year, work in Springfield was irregular. Like many lawyers of the western frontier, Lincoln joined the circuit, travelling from town to town with a judge to hear cases in rural communities that had no courts of their own. The circuit riders shared small inns, often 20 men to a room. Lincoln usually slept on the floor. When rain turned the roads to mud, they continued on foot. His long legs made him the natural choice to test the depth of rivers and streams before the others crossed. The hardships never troubled him. He enjoyed the travel, the company, and the conversations. He was known for his humour, fairness, and intelligence, and his stories often filled the evenings with laughter. To Lincoln, honesty was the foundation of character. "If you cannot be an honest lawyer," he once said, "resolve to be honest without being a lawyer." In politics, Lincoln was a devoted member of the Whig Party. He worked tirelessly for its candidates, campaigning across Illinois and building friendships that would serve him for years to come. Yet in matters of the heart, he was less certain. Around this time, he met Mary Todd at a Springfield party. She was young, lively, and confident, a woman of ambition who openly declared she wished to marry a man destined for the presidency. Lincoln was shy, awkward, and entirely unpolished, but Mary saw something extraordinary in him. They married on November 4, 1842. Lincoln joked that he could hardly believe anyone would marry him, writing to a friend that it was a matter of profound wonder. On Mary's wedding ring were engraved the words, "Love is eternal." They began their married life modestly, first in a hotel, then in a small house of their own, the first home Lincoln had ever owned. 9 months later, their first son Robert was born. 2 years after came Edward, who died at the age of 3. Later, 2 more sons, Willie and Thomas, arrived. Lincoln affectionately called the youngest Tad because of his large head and tiny body, saying he looked like a tadpole. Both parents were devoted to their children. The boys often ran wild in their father's law office, scattering papers, spilling ink, and turning the room into a playground. Lincoln's partner would grow frustrated, but Lincoln only laughed, refusing to scold them. After 6 years in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln set his sights on national office. In 1841, he sought nomination as the Whig candidate for Congress, but was passed over. Still, he supported his rival's campaign, believing that patience and loyalty would be rewarded in time. His faith was justified. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He moved to Washington, D.C., to take his seat in Congress. Mary and the children joined him for a short while, but their sons caused such chaos that they soon returned to Illinois. Lincoln devoted himself entirely to his duties. He served on committees, spoke in debates, and attended every session. but his efforts went largely unnoticed. When his 2-year term in Congress ended, Abraham Lincoln returned to Springfield with a sense of disappointment, convinced that his efforts had done little to shape the course of national events. Setting aside political ambition, he immersed himself in his law practice, building a reputation for honesty and sharp reasoning, and believing his days in public service were behind him. But history had other plans. In 1854, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act reignited the bitter debate over slavery, stirring something deep within Lincoln. The issue that had long divided the nation now called him back to the political stage, setting in motion the next, defining chapter of his life. For decades, Americans had argued over where slavery should exist, and whether it should exist at all. In 1820, Congress had sought compromise with the Missouri Compromise. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, but the agreement declared that all future territories north of its southern border would remain free. For more than 30 years, that fragile boundary kept the peace. Then, in 1854, Congress overturned it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened vast new territories to slavery, declaring that the settlers themselves could decide whether to permit it. To many, it was a betrayal of the nation's earlier promise. Abolitionists denounced the act. So did Lincoln. Although he opposed slavery, Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the strict sense. He believed that the Constitution protected the rights of slaveholders where slavery already existed. To abolish it by force, he warned, would risk civil conflict. Yet he also believed slavery was morally wrong and must not be allowed to spread. If confined to its existing boundaries, he reasoned, it would wither away in time, undone by the nation's conscience. To Lincoln, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a disastrous retreat from progress. It opened new lands to slavery and defied the moral foundation on which the Republic had been built. The man behind the act was Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, a former colleague and now a political rival. Douglas defended his position with the idea of popular sovereignty, claiming that true democracy meant letting each territory decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Lincoln saw in that argument a dangerous contradiction. When Douglas came to speak in Springfield, Lincoln challenged him publicly. The following day, Lincoln addressed a crowd that filled the square. For 3 hours, he dismantled Douglas's defense, arguing that popular sovereignty could only make sense if black Americans were not regarded as human beings. Lincoln declared that the nation had been founded on the belief that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. The speech electrified Illinois. Newspapers reprinted it across the state. Practically overnight, Lincoln's name was known beyond Springfield. Later that year, he sought a seat in the United States Senate. He came close to victory, but fell short. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had fractured American politics. Long-standing parties splintered under the strain of the slavery debate. Many Democrats left their ranks, while the Whig Party, Lincoln's political home, began to dissolve. Out of that chaos arose a new movement, united in opposition to the expansion of slavery. Its members called themselves Republicans. Lincoln, a lifelong Whig, now became one of the leading Republicans in Illinois. In 1856, the party nominated explorer and military officer John C. Fremont as its first presidential candidate. Lincoln was nearly chosen as his running mate, but fell just short of the nomination. Fremont lost the election, and the pro-slavery Democrat James Buchanan became president. Lincoln was disappointed but not deterred. 2 years later, in 1858, he again faced Stephen Douglas, but this time for a seat in the United States Senate. The Illinois Republicans nominated him unanimously. In 1858, as Abraham Lincoln accepted the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate, he delivered words that would resonate through generations. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He warned that the nation could not endure half slave and half free, that it must choose one path or the other. If slavery continued to spread, it would consume the Republic, but if it ended, America might still fulfill its promise of liberty for all. With that declaration, Lincoln placed himself squarely in the heart of the nation's greatest moral struggle. Later that year, he and Senator Stephen Douglas met again in a series of 7 public debates that riveted the country. From small prairie towns to distant cities, crowds gathered by the thousands, while newspapers printed their words in full. For the first time, Americans were following a political contest as it unfolded, and at its centre stood Abraham Lincoln, the man who had dared to challenge a divided nation's conscience. The two men could not have been more different. Douglas was short, broad and polished, known as the Little Giant for his commanding presence and resonant voice. Lincoln, by contrast, was tall, lean, and unrefined. His clothes were simple, his movements awkward, and his voice high and sharp. Douglas travelled in a private carriage. Lincoln rode the train with ordinary passengers, sharing jokes and stories along the way. On stage, both were formidable. Each could hold an audience for hours. Their arguments over the future of slavery defined the moral and political fault line of their age. In the end, Lincoln lost the Senate election once again. Yet in defeat, he had achieved something far greater. His words and reasoning had made him known across the United States. The following year, he was invited to speak in New York City before a sophisticated and skeptical audience. Standing beneath the chandeliers of Cooper Union, Lincoln spoke calmly and clearly about slavery and the principles of the nation's founding. His honesty and moral conviction won them over. It was his first major appearance on the East Coast, and it established him as a national figure. But as Lincoln's reputation grew, the country itself was breaking apart. The divide over slavery deepened. Southern leaders threatened secession. President James Buchanan proved unable to hold the Union together or even maintain unity within his own party. By 1860, the Democratic Party had split between Northern and Southern factions, each nominating its own candidate. The young Republican Party, founded only 6 years earlier to oppose the spread of slavery, chose Abraham Lincoln as its nominee. He became known as the rail candidate, a reminder of his frontier youth when he had split fence rails by hand. The image spoke to voters of humility and hard work, of a man who understood ordinary people. Lincoln himself did little campaigning and held modest expectations for victory. On election night, he gathered with friends at the Illinois State House as telegraph messages arrived from across the nation. By 2 in the morning, the results were clear. The Democratic vote was divided, and Abraham Lincoln had won more votes than any other candidate. Mary Lincoln was overjoyed. She had long believed her husband destined for the presidency. Abraham, however, could not rest. "I then felt as I never had before," he said, "the responsibility that was upon me." It was a remarkable ascent. He had only a single year of formal schooling. He had never led an army or served as a governor. He had spent most of his life in small frontier towns and had lost every race he ran for the Senate. Yet now this self-taught lawyer from Illinois was President of the United States. During the presidential campaign, an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell wrote to Abraham Lincoln, suggesting he grow a beard to soften his appearance. Amused by her advice, he did, and soon the tall man with the gentle eyes and solemn face became one of the most recognizable figures in American life. Yet the image that charmed a nation would soon be tested by turmoil. When Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, his election triggered a crisis that threatened the very survival of the Union. Even before he took office, the country began to fracture. In the South, outrage turned into open defiance as 7 slave-holding states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. Within months, 4 more followed, and the bearded president-to-be found himself facing a nation on the brink of war. At his inauguration, Lincoln stood before a restless crowd outside the Capitol. He spoke calmly, urging unity, and promised that he would not allow the Union to be divided. He avoided direct mention of slavery, knowing that 4 slave states such as Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri had not seceded. He needed their loyalty to keep the Union from collapsing entirely. Despite his hopes, war soon came. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Union troops stationed at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. The Civil War had begun. 80 years earlier, Americans from both North and South had fought together for independence. Now they faced one another across battlefields. The conflict tore families apart, even Lincoln's own. His wife, Mary, had relatives in the South who owned slaves and fought for the Confederacy. The call to arms brought a surge of volunteers in the North. Most believed the war would be brief. Lincoln himself expected a quick victory. Yet as commander-in-chief, he faced challenges for which no president before him had been prepared. He believed that extraordinary times demanded extraordinary authority. Without waiting for Congress, he expanded the army, authorized spending, and curtailed certain civil liberties. He allowed military officers to imprison anyone accused of threatening the war effort, even without trial. Congress later ratified his actions, accepting that they were necessary to preserve the nation. But the war dragged on. The battles were brutal, the casualties staggering, and the outcome uncertain. Lincoln's army struggled to find consistent leadership. He had to learn strategy through study and experience, relying on generals who often failed him. His most promising early appointment was General George B. McClellan, a young officer admired for his organization and discipline. McClellan trained the Union Army into a professional fighting force, earning the devotion of his soldiers. Yet in battle, he hesitated. Again and again he delayed attacks, convinced the enemy was too strong. Lincoln's frustration grew. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," he remarked, "I would like to borrow it for a time." While Lincoln learned the burdens of leadership, his family adjusted to life in the White House. The mansion was grand but neglected, and Mary Lincoln began extensive renovations, spending more money than Congress had intended. The president, who was struggling to fund soldiers' supplies, was furious. He told her the spending had to stop. Their sons, Willie and Tad, brought liveliness to the somber household. They befriended soldiers, played war games on the roof, and filled the corridors with noise. The public was charmed by them. Gifts arrived daily like pets, toys, and even livestock. Tad once drove a goat-pulled chair through a crowded reception. Lincoln never scolded them. Even during meetings with generals, the boys would burst in, climb onto his shoulders, or fall asleep at his feet. The president's tenderness toward his children reflected his deep compassion for others. Visitors crowded the White House, many seeking favors or pardons. Mothers and wives pleaded for the lives of soldiers condemned to death for desertion or cowardice. Lincoln listened patiently and often granted mercy. "I cannot refuse," he once said, "when a poor fellow asks for his life." To many Americans, he became known simply as Father Abraham. That compassion was tested in 1862 when tragedy struck his own home. 11-year-old Willie Lincoln died of typhoid fever. The loss shattered both parents. Willie had been gentle and reflective, much like his father. Mary descended into grief and turned to spiritualists, holding seances in the hope of hearing her son's voice again. Washington society, already unkind to her, now whispered cruelly that she was unstable or even disloyal. Lincoln grieved in silence, shutting himself away to weep in private. When he finally emerged, it was with a quiet determination that masked his sorrow. From that moment on, he carried his pain within, choosing to bear it alone as he led a nation torn apart by war. By the second year of the Civil War, the toll of the conflict had become almost unbearable. More than 100 battles had been fought, and tens of thousands lay dead or wounded. Yet despite the immense sacrifice, neither the Union nor the Confederacy had gained the upper hand, and Lincoln, burdened by both personal loss and national tragedy, pressed on with unwavering resolve. In the North, enthusiasm for enlistment was fading. Fewer men were willing to join the army, and the government was running out of money to sustain the fight. Meanwhile, the South held firm in its rebellion, defending a way of life built upon slavery. Until this point, President Lincoln had avoided addressing slavery directly. He understood that once he did, the war would take on an entirely new purpose. Abolitionists urged him to make slavery illegal, believing that the war should serve not only to preserve the Union, but also to end human enslavement. Yet many Northerners opposed such a move. Lincoln feared dividing his own supporters and losing the fragile unity he needed to win the war. There were also legal constraints. The Constitution protected slavery in the states where it already existed. As president, Lincoln had sworn to uphold the law. He questioned whether he had the constitutional power to abolish slavery on his own. Eventually, Lincoln found a path forward, one grounded in law and wartime necessity. Under the rules of war, an enemy's property could be seized if it was being used to support military efforts. Since the Confederacy relied heavily on enslaved labor to feed and supply its armies, Lincoln concluded that the government could lawfully take that labor away. Congress began passing measures to weaken slavery. Enslaved people who escaped from rebel owners or were captured by Union forces would no longer be returned. They were declared free. Then, Lincoln decided to act. Working alone and in secret, he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. The document did not abolish slavery everywhere. It applied only to those states in open rebellion, declaring that all enslaved people there shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. In the loyal border states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, Slavery remained legal for the moment. Lincoln trusted that when peace returned, Congress would take the final step to abolish it nationwide. He knew the order could not be enforced until Union armies prevailed. Southern planters would not obey a president they no longer recognized. "I feel like a man trying to pass a law to change the path of a comet," he admitted. Yet he also understood the larger meaning. From that moment forward, the Union's cause was no longer only the preservation of the nation, but the destruction of slavery itself. When Lincoln presented the proclamation to his cabinet, he made it clear that his decision was final. He was not seeking counsel, he was informing them of what must be done. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863. Word spread rapidly through the South. Enslaved men and women fled toward Union lines seeking freedom. For the first time, the Union Army began enlisting black soldiers. They fought with extraordinary courage, many against those who had once enslaved them. As the Civil War pressed on, nearly 200,000 black soldiers took up arms for the Union, fighting not only to preserve the Republic, but to claim freedom for themselves and for those who would follow. Their courage and sacrifice strengthened the cause Lincoln had long defended. By the third year of the war, the president finally discovered the leader capable of bringing that cause to victory: Ulysses S. Grant. A man of calm resolve and unshakable purpose, Grant grasped the harsh truth of what it would take to end the conflict, and was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Grant had already secured a major victory at Vicksburg, a triumph that gave the Union full control of the Mississippi River. Yet he knew that battles alone would not end the conflict. The true objective was to destroy the South's ability to wage war. His strategy was unrelenting. Union forces would attack on multiple fronts, striking railroads, factories, and supply lines, the lifeblood of the Confederate Army. The campaign would be long and brutal. Grant's goal was simple but merciless: to wear the South down until surrender was its only choice. Lincoln trusted him. After one particularly bloody battle, critics demanded Grant's removal. The president refused. "I cannot spare this man," he said. "He fights." But as the war consumed more lives, the North began to falter. Fewer men volunteered for service, and public morale declined. In 1863, Lincoln ordered the nation's first military draft. In New York City, violent riots erupted. Many working men protested that they were being forced to die for a war they believed was freeing others rather than protecting themselves. Discontent spread across the North. Some even began to argue that the South should be allowed to go its own way. Lincoln knew the Union could not survive such doubt. He needed to remind the nation why it fought and why it must endure. That moment came later that year in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Months earlier, one of the war's bloodiest battles had taken place there. The Union Army had turned back a Confederate invasion, but at a staggering cost. More than 3,000 Union soldiers and nearly 5,000 Confederates were killed. The battlefields of Gettysburg were now being transformed into a national cemetery. On November 19, 1863, thousands gathered to dedicate the ground. The main address was delivered by Edward Everett, a celebrated orator who spoke for nearly 2 hours. When he finished, Abraham Lincoln rose to deliver a few remarks. His speech lasted barely 2 minutes. His words were direct and profound. He began by recalling the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He reminded the crowd that the United States was the first nation founded upon that belief, and that the war was testing whether such a nation could long endure. Lincoln called upon the living to dedicate themselves to the cause for which the soldiers had died, to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he finished, there was silence. Some said the crowd was too deeply moved to applaud. Even Edward Everett later wrote to Lincoln, admitting that in 2 minutes the president had captured the meaning of the occasion far better than he had in 2 hours. History has long agreed that the Gettysburg Address ranks among the most powerful and enduring speeches ever given. Yet when Lincoln's final words faded over the fields of Pennsylvania, the war was far from done. Nearly 1,000 days of bloodshed had already passed, and the nation's hardest trial still lay ahead. By 1864, as Lincoln's first term drew to a close, the country remained engulfed in conflict. With another presidential election approaching, doubts grew about whether democracy could withstand such chaos. Some advisers urged him to delay the vote until peace was restored, but Lincoln refused. "We cannot have free government without elections," he insisted. The campaign went forward, though the Confederate states would not participate. Lincoln's challenger was George McClellan, the former Union general who had once hesitated to fight. McClellan promised peace through negotiation, suggesting he would compromise with the South to end the conflict. Lincoln doubted his chances. After years of bloodshed, the nation was weary. Many citizens longed for the war's end regardless of the outcome, yet Lincoln knew that the soldiers supported him. He ensured that those serving in the army could vote from the field. Then, as the election drew near, the tide of war turned decisively. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. General Philip Sheridan defeated Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley, and General Ulysses S. Grant was closing in on the Confederate capital of Richmond. These victories restored faith in the Union cause. In November, Lincoln was re-elected to a second term. By early 1865, the end was in sight. On March 25th, Grant's army captured Richmond. Soon after, he cornered the forces of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered. The Civil War was over. Lincoln was not present at the surrender, but Grant carried out his orders with dignity. The defeated Confederate soldiers were not humiliated. They were allowed to keep their horses and were given food for their journey home. Grant's mercy reflected Lincoln's vision for peace without vengeance. In Washington, jubilant crowds filled the streets. People cheered beneath the windows of the White House. Young Tad Lincoln appeared, waving a captured Confederate flag, and the crowd erupted in applause. When the president stepped forward, he asked the band to play Dixie. He told the crowd he had always liked the tune, and that it now belonged to the nation once more. Lincoln understood that ending the war was only half the task. Healing the Union would be harder still. With his support, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. In his second inaugural address, delivered on the steps of the Capitol, Lincoln called for reconciliation. He urged Americans to welcome the South back with malice toward none, with charity for all. But among those in the audience that day was actor John Wilkes Booth, who despised him. Booth was one of the most celebrated performers of his time, admired for his looks and charisma. But behind the charm lay fanaticism. He was devoted to the Confederacy and believed that slavery was not only justified but beneficial. To him, Lincoln was a tyrant who had destroyed the America he loved. Booth began to plan an act of revenge. A month later, Lincoln had a troubling dream. In it, he wandered through the White House and came upon a coffin. When he asked whose it was, a guard replied, "The President. He was killed by an assassin." 3 days later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theatre with Mary and several friends. Earlier that afternoon, he had told her, "We must both be more cheerful in the future." They arrived that evening ready for a rare moment of rest. Lincoln sat in a rocking chair, smiling and whispering to Mary as the performance began. John Wilkes Booth knew the president would be there. As a familiar face at the theatre, he entered unnoticed and made his way to the presidential box. Moving quietly, he raised his weapon and fired. The sound was lost in the laughter of the audience. Booth leapt from the balcony to the stage, shouting words of triumph, and escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house. The bed was too short for his tall frame, and his body was laid diagonally, his head supported by pillows. Surrounded by his family, doctors and cabinet members, he remained unconscious for 9 hours. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. The man who had preserved the Union, abolished slavery, and spoken with rare compassion for both friend and foe was gone, yet the ideals he lived for endured. His leadership had guided the nation through its darkest trial, and his legacy would forever shape its moral compass. In the days that followed, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was hunted down by Union soldiers. Cornered in his hiding place, Booth tried to escape but was shot and killed. He died convinced of his own righteousness, while the nation he had wounded was united in grief. Across America, bells tolled, flags hung in mourning, and millions wept for the fallen president who had given his life to keep the country whole. In Washington, clocks were stopped at the moment of Lincoln's death. Thousands of people filled the streets in silence. His body lay in state beneath the Capitol dome, and millions across the country came to pay their respects. Soon after, his coffin was placed aboard a special funeral train bound for Springfield, Illinois. There, the president would be laid to rest. The train retraced the same path Lincoln had taken to Washington 4 years earlier, when he began his presidency. Now it carried him home. The coffin of his young son Willie, who had died 3 years before, travelled beside him. At every stop along the route, crowds gathered for solemn processions. The casket rested on a wagon draped in black cloth surrounded by soldiers, flowers and flags. Mourners waited for hours, often standing in lines that stretched for miles, to say farewell to the man they called Father Abraham. Mary Lincoln was too grief-stricken to attend. The loss shattered her. In her sorrow she withdrew from public life, yet even in mourning criticism followed her. Some accused her, unfairly, of taking items from the White House that did not belong to her. Her final years were marked by tragedy. The death of her youngest son Tad at 18, which likely from tuberculosis left her devastated once more. Of her 4 children, only Robert lived to adulthood, but their relationship was strained. At one point he had her committed to a hospital claiming she was mentally unstable. Robert Todd Lincoln went on to lead a distinguished life. He became a lawyer, a successful businessman, and later served as Secretary of War and US Minister to Great Britain. He had 3 children, several grandchildren, and lived to the age of 82, passing away in 1926. More than 2 centuries after his birth, Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most revered figures in American history. His image endures on the penny and the $5 bill. His likeness stands in marble at the Lincoln Memorial, and his face is carved into Mount Rushmore beside the nation's greatest presidents. His name graces cities, counties, schools, and landmarks across the United States. Thousands of books continue to explore his life and legacy, and each year Americans honor him on President's Day. From the moment of his death, Lincoln's memory took on the power of legend. To many, he became a martyr to freedom and a symbol of the nation's conscience. Yet behind that image was a thoughtful man. He made mistakes, but he also grew beyond them. His leadership was guided not by power, but by principle. Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union in its darkest hour, ended the institution of slavery, and gave new meaning to the American promise that all men are created equal. In his courage, empathy, and unshakable conviction, he defined the very essence of moral leadership. The nation he saved continues to measure itself against the standard he set. America was fortunate to have him,